As John mentioned, Refed is a nonprofit. We are primarily focused in the US and we are entirely dedicated to reducing food loss and waste. We focus on really four angles to do that. The first is providing data and insights on the topic. The second is trying to catalyze more capital into the space and really help that capital find where the innovation and where a good matches to place that capital. The third is our business initiatives, and you'll where we work with the food industry. You'll learn more about that today. And then lastly, we try to act as the hub and connector in the space. So we host a big annual summit on the topic, a lot of programming and webinars and networks and things like that. Um, so with that, I will dive right in and try to pick up where Paul left off. Thank you so much, Paul, for that introduction to the topic. It's always fun to hear how somebody else characterizes it. Right, and I will focus primarily here in the US, which, as you saw from his maps, is a big driver of waste. So in the US, um, we estimate that about 38%, somewhere around a third, 38% of all of the food in our food supply goes uneaten. Approximately $495 billion worth of food. And of course, this is all happening while there are still 47 million Americans who are food insecure. Next slide, please. Um, so the bulk of that, and I'll take just a small moment to talk about our terminology because it's a little bit different than the food loss and waste frame that Paul said. So we look at kind of what is all of the food that is surplus, and we call that surplus food, regardless of if it gets donated, if it gets turned into animal feed, if it gets composted. Um, all of that is surplus food, and then we look at the destinations of where it goes. So if you take everything that goes unsold, uneaten, only about 2% of that is being donated today. About 7% is being recycled into things like animal feed. And then the bulk of it is going to what we call waste destinations. All right, next slide, please. And if you saw there, it's close to 2% of the US GDP is about the value of all that food. Paul has already covered some of these environmental impacts, and I just want to emphasize it has a huge climate impact, but there are other impacts as well. So the EP estimates that the equivalent of about 16% of US cropland is going to grow food that never gets eaten. That is an area of land the size of California and New York combined, not to mention about 22% of all freshwater use, just to give you a sense. Go to the next slide. And just to double down on something Paul was talking about around methane and landfills, just last year, the EPA came, or I guess maybe it's 23 now, came out with a report that for the first time put a number to just how much of the methane that is coming from landfills is coming from food. And they estimated conservatively that about 58% of all the methane from landfills is coming from food scraps in those landfills. And landfills in the US are about a third, are the third largest source of methane. So it's really significant if you're somebody who's really trying to focus in on methane. These food scraps are a big portion of that. And one of the challenges is that even when landfills get capped, the food often decays before those landfills get capped because it is such a rapidly decaying product. And so that was part of why it's such a big portion, is that it's almost like no matter what the capping rules are, the technology's capturing that methane, they're not put on quickly enough to really catch the methane from the food, which is, a significant problem, and why that prevention side that Paul was talking about is so important. One of the reasons. All right, next slide. And just to make this point, in the US as well, upstream emissions, much larger impact than downstream, even though that methane even though food scraps are a big part of the methane, for the overall picture, upstream is still a much larger footprint overall. Go ahead. And again, just to think about things beyond climate, there are estimates that if we were to reduce food waste by 50%, it would reduce land use by about an area the size of Arizona. And that is not just, it is rainforests, but it is also land right here in the US. So just in 2022, the WWF estimates that an area of land almost the size of Yellowstone Park was converted from native grasslands to agriculture and cropland. And so, even here at grasslands, it's things, it is rainforest, but it's also other lands that are impacted. Um, in addition, we think about biodiversity. So along with those native ecosystems, trying to cut back on food waste can help try to reduce losses to biodiversity and to water use as well. All right, so we have now convinced you all of the problem, and I've found that it tends not to be hard to sort of convince people there's a problem here. And of course, you're all wondering, what do we do about it? So at ReFed, as I mentioned, we really focus on data and insights. And one of the expressions of that, and a place you can find a lot of our analysis, is in a product we call the ReFed Insights Engine. This is free and available to everyone. It's actually a combination of 6 different tools that try to break out our data into usable kind of format. So we look at, what is the problem? We analyze solutions. I'll get into that in a moment. We have a directory where you can find different organizations that are working on this, calculate impact. We have a capital tracker where you can see some of the deals that are happening. You'll hear more about that in the next session, not today, not this morning. And then we also have a way to track policies in all of the states in the US. So we'll drop a link in the chat. Feel free to check those tools out. And some of the information I'm about to show you does come from those tools. Go to the next slide, please. Okay, so where is all of this waste happening? I think one of the challenges of food loss and waste is that we talk about it as if it's one problem, but it's actually very different if you're looking at tomatoes that are not harvested on a farm in the US versus a, restaurant in the US that is serving too many potatoes on their breakfast platters versus a market in Africa, right? And so really when we talk about how do we fix food waste, it is a challenge of essentially improving the efficiency and reducing losses for so many different products at so many different stages. And it's really many problems, not just one. And as you can see here, there's waste happening. The residential sector is the largest sector. So that's you and I in our homes, throwing food out in little bits and pieces here and there. But certainly there's a lot on farm, and this farm estimate does not even include animal products. It's really just looking at produce. And so it's probably even bigger. And certainly, it's happening along the way in manufacturing and distribution and food service and in grocery stores. Though actually grocery stores are the smallest portion. Okay, why? So when you step back and think about why, I like to categorize this into sort of 2 different levels of why, right? There's the root causes of why is this happening, and then there's kind of why it looks like it's happening in the more immediate way. So if you really want to peel back the onion, why is this happening? Food is relatively cheap, certainly in the US, and in other developed countries as well. It is a small portion of our budgets in the US. The US has these smallest expenditures per person. So it's the smallest portion of people's budget in the US as compared with any other country. It's also relatively cheap to throw things out, right? Waste fees are not really something that people consider when they're creating their business plan, let's say. It's invisible because we don't measure it, so it's actually pretty challenging to know how much is being wasted. It's dispersed across the food system and across time, so it's often happening in little bits and pieces over time. In the US, it is relatively culturally acceptable. We want to throw a big party, we want to have lots of food available. no one's looking at all the food left over at the end of the party going like, oh, you're not a good host. You have too much food left over, right? Um, in some ways it is disincentivized. Certainly, the more food a business sells, the more profit they make. And so that can be a challenge. And if when you look at signals across the supply chain, food safety is driving a lot of it. So there's, so many rules and a lot of food that does get thrown out for the sake of food safety. There's no immediate crisis. And of course, it's just complicated. There are so many different food types, and it's also complicated by the fact that it's a perishable item, and that adds a lot of complication. So those are some of the root causes. Now, if you look more immediately, like what is happening, well, actually the biggest amount of all of the surplus is in trimmings and byproducts. So that's in manufacturing, the potato peels that are coming from French fry production, let's say. And really in any manufacturing plant, you have a lot of trimmings and byproducts that are coming out of that. That's a big volume. Second, excess. This is overproduction. Maybe it's restaurants and catering facilities that make more and have more in the back of the kitchen that never comes out. It's also plate waste. So that's waste on people's plates after food is served in restaurants. That's a big part of it. Food not being harvested. There's an enormous amount of like perfectly edible, nutritious, good fruits and vegetables that are not being harvested off the farm for reasons of variable pricing. There are quality specs. Maybe it's not the right shape, size, um, or also there are a lot of labor shortages. And that's actually something as we look ahead, with maybe new rules on immigration that there could be some impacts to labor shortages as well. Food gets spoiled. Sometimes that's because it's over ordered, right? And then it doesn't sell and then it spoils. And then there's an issue around the date labels on food and really a misunderstanding across the country that is driving people to throw food out prematurely and then also have stores take products off their shelves prematurely as well. So what do we do about this? Paul kind of referenced this in that nice upside down triangle, but really, I like to boil it down to just kind of a similar to in plastics, a reduce, reuse, recycle mentality. So first, let's prevent food from going to waste. Um, prevent food from being extra in the first place, right? Let's not have that extra food happen. If we do, let's rescue it, get it to people. And if that's not possible, then let's look at recycling solutions. Certainly animal feed is a good one, and also composting and others. Now at ReFed, we have gone pretty deep into an analysis. We have modeled 42 different solutions to food waste. We've identified another 40 or so that we know will help. We just haven't had the data to really analyze them. And we divide those into seven larger categories, which I don't think we'll go into today, but you can find this all on our website. And what we've really found is taking root today. If you go to the next slide, please. Kind of here's some that are really, I would say, just to highlight a few, kind of we're seeing a lot of action and trends in some solutions. So first, of course, technology, AI is having a big influence. It's helping to manage forecasts. So, in any business that's managing a lot of data, a lot of different food products, and trying to predict how much they're selling or they will sell, we've seen AI products really make a big difference in those for those businesses in cutting down the extra that is being ordered. Also in kind of more frictionless integration. So things like imaging where you can track what's happening, track maybe how much is going to waste without having anyone having to do anything, I think has been really effective as well. And we're seeing that pick up. Also monitoring, so at a higher resolution. So, it used to be maybe you knew something about a truckload of product. Well, now there's the ability to really monitor at the pallet level, sometimes at the case level. There are sensors, there are temperature monitors, and all of that information is being combined to help figure out where best to route this product so that it can sell and within a good shelf life. And so we're seeing things in that category pick up as well. At the consumer level, um, you may have heard about these kind of kitchen dehydrator products that take your scraps and kind of grind them, dehydrate them, and make it a little bit easier to manage whether you mix them into your own soil or send them to a compost facility. Intelligent packaging. So, people may not understand date labels, but now there's different approaches at how do we actually indicate on the package via maybe something that's tracking temperature if a product is still good to eat or not. So, different ways that intelligent packaging is happening, as well as food management and storage. So, we're seeing some up and coming things around smart Tupperware type of ideas that are interesting. On the business side, certainly upcycling, so taking some of those byproducts and trimmings of trying to find ways to create new food products with that. Um, there are different apps that are helping businesses sell things at the last minute that are taking off. And then just doubling down on best practices. So, it's business is not trying to waste food, right? But sometimes it's those standard operating procedures are just not being met in the way that they want to see. So sometimes it's really just a doubling down on those best practices. Globally, there's a lot of innovation happening at the post-harvest level. So trying to take you know, supply chains that maybe don't have cold chain or do have a lot of pest issues after a product is harvested and trying to find a way to provide low cost solutions that can help there. And sometimes that's cold chain and sometimes it's not. So to give you a couple quick examples, one of those in that more global supply chain are these PICS bags. I saw Paul had a picture of these as well. Um, think of it as like a very fancy Ziploc that can seal and reduce the amount of pests that are getting to, originally it was cowpeas in Africa, and now I think it's a variety of different grains. But just protecting from those pests has reduced pesticide use because they were spraying them on the product before directly. Um, but they've sold, I think, about 50 million of these bags at this point. They estimate they've saved farmers because farmers are able to hold on to their product longer and get better income. They've saved them about $1.8 billion in like additional revenue they've been able to make because of that reduced losses and also um, the ability to kind of choose when they're selling their product and have a little more time to do that. So that's one example. Another is this is an app. It's called Too Good to Go. It helps restaurants to sell a product at the last minute. At the end of the night, you have 6 sandwiches left. You have 8 orders of lasagna. Too Good to Go is an app where you can sell it at a deep discount. This product is now in 17 countries. They estimate they saved about 120 million pounds of food just last year alone. So it's really taken off. Next slide, please. Um, this is, a much less sexy example. This is Compass Group, which is largest food service company in the world, but we're seeing the same thing with Sodexo, Aramark, all of the big food service companies, where they're doing much less sexy things. They're tracking their waste. They're serving, their buffets in smaller bowls. They're trying to offer flexible portions so you can get a baby burrito instead of a big burrito. And all of this seems to be really adding up to work well. There's, one place where Compass estimates they've cut their food waste in half. They're seeing similar results around the world. So that's been positive as well. But there's a lot that has to go into these solutions. So of course, there's like the direct innovation and that we're seeing, but we also have identified other levers that have impact Financing is one, and you will hear much more about that in the other sessions. Um, Also, there is policy that is setting the stage for these. And engagement is one that we don't, I think, give as much focus as maybe we should as sort of the ecosystem working on this, because really at the end of the day, we need people to engage. We need to be engaging this because this problem is so spread out. It really takes kind of an army of people bought into the problem and thinking about solutions and or just being willing to take the steps that their supervisors are asking of them, that sort of thing. So that's an area that, we see as a need. Next slide, please. For today, I'm just going to zoom in on policy real quick. Um, because it is certainly in the US a time of a lot of change. We saw some really exciting action out of the federal government over the past couple of years. We saw record federal funding. Just last year, the government put out a national strategy, and together that has set the agencies up to actually do quite a bit. Now, of course, there's a lot of question marks around what's going to happen with the administration and agency work, but there's a lot about this topic that we believe is actually pretty attractive for the incoming administration. We think it's an effective issue to be working on from the standpoint of a high-priced food environment. And we hear a lot about food prices. Should tariffs happen, we're going to continue to hear a lot about food prices. And it could just be that this is kind of a winning way for the administration to look like they're doing something on that. So we're optimistic that the work will continue. In addition, this is a Farm Bill year, and so there's a lot of legislative activity that's happening at the federal level, primarily to try to influence what makes it into the Farm Bill. At the state level, we're seeing a lot of action, and I think, given question marks federally, we'll see more at the state level. Just this past year, we had 100 bills introduced, 18 were passed. One of the biggest ones this year was one that standardize the way date labels on food are done in California, and we believe that will likely have a ripple effect and set some precedents across the country, and maybe even lead to a federal bill to come. Knowing I'm running short on time, I won't go deep in here, but I will say that probably one of the most influential state policies that we're seeing passed are what we call organic waste bans. And so that is laws that restrict food from going into the landfill. And there are 12 states, including DC, that have some kind of restriction on food going to landfill. And typically they're pairing those with funding because they need the funding to build out the infrastructure for where the food will go if it won't be in a landfill. So often that's going to build out composting or anaerobic digestion. Go on. And again, as I said, I think it is a time of change. I think we're going to see more and more state policy happening. We've heard murmurs of some of the satellite data that is now available for methane to potentially be something that eventually we could see policies or regulations linked to at the state level. I think federally, we will see the strategy go ahead, but probably from a funding perspective, it will decrease.